Hi, I want to show you something really interesting about filters, and I'll be demonstrating this with digital filters, but the same things will apply to any kind of filters, whether they're digital or analog, and regardless of what software you use. Specifically, I want to show you how filters smear things in the time domain. You might have noticed there's someone sitting on my head today. As long as he behaves himself, I'm going to leave him there. So let's get started. I'm going to use isotope RX because if you've seen other videos that I do, you know I love isotope RX. And I'm going to start out by creating silence. So I'm going to create 1 second of silence using the signal generator. And this is at 48 kilohertz sampling rate. And we're in mono. I'm in mono because you won't see anything special if I switch to stereo, so it makes sense to just stay mono. Now what I'm doing is zooming in on the audio until at some point isotope RX will show me individual samples and actually let me edit with my mouse a single sample of audio. And I'm carrying just one sample up near to the maximum limit for volume. And what I'm doing now is creating something called an impulse. So an impulse is when you have a single sample that's non-zero and then a whole lot of other samples that are zero. And the reason impulses are important for testing filters and plugins and anything that processes audio is that if you know what happens to one sample, that tells you a lot about what's happening to every sample. So we can't go so far as to say that every sample gets treated the same, because that depends on, let's say, on the mathematics of what kind of plugins and processing you're doing. But in the case of filters, as long as they are static filters, they're not varying over time, they're not sweeping, they're not dynamic EQ, they're not multiband compression, they're just filters that you set and you leave them alone, then we can say, and there's a mathematical proof for it, that whatever happens to one sample, exactly the same thing will happen to every other sample. So it's really instructive to look at what happens at a single sample, because then we see what happens in the time domain, and we're not distracted by all the complexity of the input waveform. So I've created this impulse, and the next thing I want to do is take out the EQ from the isotope RX EQ, and we'll just look at some basic things that people often do with EQ and just observe what happens to the signal when we do them. So the first thing I want to do is high pass filter. Let's put a high pass filter at 100 hertz. Now this is 48 dB per octave. I think if you're using musical applications, you should always use, well, I hesitate to say what you should do. You should do anything that sounds good, right? But often you'll find that, especially if you want to keep that analog sound, and I'm clicking the analog mode filter, then you want to usually use gentler slope filters than the gentlest slope that you can possibly use and still get what you want. And so in this case, the gentlest slope I have available to me is a 12 dB per octave filter, which mathematically is it's called a second order Butterworth filter. Butterworth, Butterworth, is the name of an audio engineer almost 100 years ago, I think, who came up with the foundations for the theory that we use to understand digital filters. So without further ado, let's process this. And then let's have a look at what happened to the signal. I want to back up a little bit. Let's get this filter thing out of the way. Let's go back to direct sample edit. All right. So just a moment ago, hold on, yeah, you're seeing this kind of wavy thing happening, and then it's gone as soon as I adjust the zoom. This is not actually something that's happening to the audio. If you look at the samples, the squares represent the samples, they are not doing this wavy thing that the blue line is doing. The blue line is an interpolation graph, which means that isotope is connecting these samples using a mathematical function that tries to draw something smooth between them. And the particular function it's using, in fact, we can look at the spectrogram settings. In this case, that's spectrogram settings. That's not what I was looking for. I think it's up here then in the preferences maybe. Let's try display. Yeah, so waveform interpolation order. The default order is a 33rd order polynomial, which means that it's an I think an equation isn't right. It's a formula, a function that has as its highest exponential power x to the 33rd power. And that's a very complicated formula, which gives us these very complicated looking wavy things. But I'm not a fan of those because they indicate something approaching a mathematical ideal of how this should be interpolated when it goes out to your sound card and through your digital to analog converter. But I think it's very unlikely. Let's say I'm sure it's not possible that your digital analog converter looks anything like that 33rd order polynomial. And so I just want to see the digital things interpolated linearly, and that's what I'm doing here. So whoa, let's back up. Right. So let's compare. Here's before we filtered, and I have to zoom in and zoom out to stop that interpolation. And then after we filtered, you can see what happened is mainly that this corner has kind of shifted down. And if we proceed to the left side of this graph, how's a good way to do that? To scan, I just want to click here. So as we move, you'll see very slowly till about here, they've returned back to 0. So that high pass filter has just offset these samples kind of just a little bit below 0. And that you can see that extends for quite a long period of time. So I'm going to go back to the original, and now I want to look at what happens as we increase the filter order. So we're increasing the slope of the filter. Let me check my messages. Okay, that can wait. Let's leave. Actually, I should leave that cutoff frequency where it is. But let's go right up to. Let's go to the Brickwall filter. So I'm not sure when they say Brickwall, they're indicating that there's a very steep slope here. But I think you can see it's not actually a perfectly vertical line, and it will never be because that's theoretically impossible. Let's have a look at what we get. So what we've gotten from this Brickwall filter is similar to what we got from the lower order filter. Hey, quiet. If you're not quiet, I'm going to send you away. I'm sure he understands everything I said. So it looks at first like similar to the original filter that we looked at, but I think you'll notice something odd going on here. If we zoom out, you'll see that this one goes up above the line and then comes back down. And I think if we zoom in on the vertical axis, yeah, you'll see that this Brickwall filter oscillates for a long time. Let's zoom in even more. So we are. This is my impulse was close to sample number 0, and we're 9,500 samples ahead, and you can see it's still ringing. So let's do some investigations about this. So I'm at a 48 kilohertz sample rate, which means that if we go out 10,000 samples after the impulse, that's about a quarter of a second of ringing coming from this Brickwall filter. And the next thing I'm interested in is at what frequency is it ringing. So when we look at the frequency domain graph, you can see this now, that the ringing is at a low frequency, and we don't see exactly what frequency it is, but as we zoom out, we can get a clearer picture. I'm going to take our friend and send him outside. All right, so you can see it's down near 100 hertz, and I happen to know, and I think you will see in just a few minutes, that it is in fact oscillating right near the cutoff frequency. So where was my EQ? So we put our cutoff just below 100 hertz, and you can see it does appear that this oscillation or ringing that happens from the filter is happening just below 100 hertz. So this is something that's really important for mixing engineers and mastering engineers, and anybody who's adjusting filters to understand, is that you cannot filter a single sample. What you can do with a single sample, let's close this and back up to my direct sample edit. So if we're looking here at my single sample, you can see in the frequency domain, a single sample impulse has equal volume all the way across the frequency, across the spectrum from 0 hertz up to the Nyquist frequency. And we know it's equal volume on this graph because it has the same brightness, same color all the way up. So what you can do with a single sample is quite limited. I'm zooming out. All you can do with it is, and let's zoom back in, you can pull it up or down. So you can make it quieter, you can make it louder. Let's have a look at the frequency domain as I'm doing this. I want to see both at the same time. There it goes. I can make it softer and I can make it louder, but I cannot do anything to the high frequencies without the low frequencies also moving exactly in the same amount. So if I bring it up here, this is the maximum volume. Everything, all frequencies are at max volume, and if I bring it down to 0, everything goes to 0. There's nothing you can do to a specific range of frequencies unless you edit more than one sample at once. So if I take the next sample next to it and move that up, now I've got a little bit of something going on in the frequency domain. I'm going to do this and you'll see something more extreme. And I think I'm going to need to zoom out to get the spectrogram to give me a wider range. Now you can kind of see it. So by putting one sample up high and the next one down low, I lost gain in the bass, and I preserved the gain in the high frequencies. When I created this signal where I have one sample up high and the next sample down low, I have created a kind of high-pass filter. Not a very good one, but it's a filter that removes low frequencies. Right, I should take this and go back to my original single sample signal. Okay, so let's continue on with the filters, which were in the EQ module. So basically, what we can see from this is that the more slope you want on the filter, the more tightly you want to cut things, the longer the filter is going to ring. And especially with a high-pass filter, that could be really dangerous because you're going to get ringing at a very audible frequency. If I'm at 100 hertz and it's ringing, very likely you're going to hear that ringing. But the ringing's not just with the Brickwall filter. Here's a 48 decibel filter. Let's process that, and let's see what kind of ringing we've got here. So it looks like it's ringing much less than its friend was. But you still see a little bit of ringing going on here. I'm going to try to zoom in to where you can see it. Let's zoom in the volume. So even at 48 decibel slope, you can see we've got ringing going out. It's difficult to say how long it is because it's infinitely long, but it's not very important if it's ringing at a low amplitude. If we're looking at the gain here, it's marked in decibels. So this initial hump here looks like it's coming in at about -40 decibels, which is, well, it has to be audible, because if it's not audible, you won't hear any difference when the filter runs. But what concerns us is after how much time is this thing still ringing. So you can see the sample numbers are marked down below, and we're going out. It looks like by the time we hit 2,000 samples, it's down at a level where you wouldn't hear it anymore. So 2,000 samples at 48 kilohertz is how long? 48 divided by 2,000 is 48 divided by 2 is 24. 24,000 divided by 1,000 is 20. It's like 24 milliseconds if I'm not doing the math wrong. It's kind of a long ringing you're getting from that 48 decibel per octave filter. Let's go back. We didn't really look at the ringing of the original 12 dB that we used, but let's have a look at that. And you can see that one is also ringing, but it goes down, it goes just above the 0 mark, and then it's back. And if there's anything going on in the way of ringing here, as we zoom in on this vertical axis, you can see it's not much. So I would say this filter is done within, this is so small, this is like almost negative 80, negative 90 dB. Let's say it's done by the time it gets here. I say done by whenever we drop below the noise floor level of gain here. So negative 90, negative 100 dB, we could call it done. This one is done within 600 samples after the impulse. So it's a pretty short ringing that comes from that. But this is important to know when you're mixing, because if you think that you can just filter anything anytime you want, any way you want, and it's not causing any kind of distortion, unwanted distortion on your audio, you may be causing some problems. What problems you're going to get are if you're high pass filtering, or if you're we should do this if you're not high pass filtering, but you're just taking the gain down on the low frequencies, like with a bell filter. Let's try that. I'm looking for the EQ module again. Let's turn this off, and let's turn this on, and let's at the same 100. That's not what I wanted. I wanted a bell. Yeah, at 100 hertz. Let's take a little take a few dB off. We're taking down 10 dB, and I'm processing. And you can see that's also doing something very similar. And it shouldn't surprise us that it's doing something very similar in the time domain, because it's doing something kind of similar in the frequency domain, which is it's reducing the volume of bass frequencies. Let's have a little zoom out and see what this looks like. It's not bad. It looks like a short excursion that it's taking. A little bit different from the high pass filters that we did, and it's ringing pretty short, about 500 samples, and it's done. But what's important to note is that as you do more and more EQ, what's happening is that these events that we call transients, like the click at the beginning of, or like the click if you click drumsticks together, or the snapping of a finger, or even one that we often don't think about is the human voice, is that it vibrates in a way where there's your vocal cords, they stay closed most of the time, and then they kind of snap open and close again, and air escapes, especially for voices in the lower frequency range, low male voices. If you look at the waveform, you can actually see it spikes every time the vocal cords open up and close. And those kind of transients will get smeared by filters, which just leave you with a feeling like the overall frequency content of the audio may be what you want, but you somehow lost clarity in terms of there's a certain loss of crispness. And it's a time domain thing. It's not something that you can, it doesn't show up on a spectrogram. If you look at the spectrum or use spectrum analyzers, you won't see that kind of error showing up. But as you pile up more and more filters, so you know right now I'm just cutting at 100 hertz, but if I cut at 100 hertz and then I take another band here at 600, and I'm going to make that really narrow and put that here, and I add more and more and more stages of filtering, and I go through more and more plugins. Eventually I will audibly lose focus and lose clarity in my sound. Let's look at what happens when we're a little bit higher up the spectrum and we take a really surgical narrow cut. I don't know what's the Q setting here. Q at 40. That's very narrow. Let's take it all the way up to 400 just for fun. I should back up. Let's back up to where we edited the sample and do this again. Right, let's have a look at what we can already see a little bit of ringing here, but we'll zoom in on that. So, wow, look at how long this ringing is. Let's zoom out so we can see it. So this is similar to what we saw with the Brickwall filter, is that the more tightly you try to control the frequency, like you try to do this cut in this really narrow frequency range, the longer the filter impulse response needs to ring in order to achieve what you're trying to do. So let's back that up and let's widen this out. So let's take it, we were at Q400, let's go to Q1 and process again. And now with Q1 you see something totally different. You see that there's a big change. Let's zoom in where we can see that. There's a big change in a very short time frame after the impulse, but it gets done much quicker. And so coming back and looking at the EQ again, basically what we can say to summarize this is the more that you try to get surgical and narrow, the longer that filter is going to have to ring in order to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And the more you widen it out, the more quickly it can do its work and get done and not smear your transients around. And then the other thing is, if I were to take a narrow cut like this, let's do the 400 again, but I don't cut it so far. I just cut it a little bit. Again, it's not going to have to ring so long because I'm not cutting so deeply. So let's hit process again and have a look. So you can still see ringing here, but the volume, the amplitude of the ringing is lower. I'm going to undo it and we'll take the gain up and compare those two again. So now I'm taking it right down 30 dB down, and you see how much bigger the amplitude of this ringing is. So what's bothersome about this is that it looks like I'm cutting out this frequency, and that's what I intend to do when I filter like this. But I'm now actually adding in some frequencies I didn't want, in the sense that now every time there's a click or a snare drum hit or anything that's similar to this transient where it's very focused in time, anything like that is going to end up having this kind of long tail ringing happening after it, because I'm cutting a frequency out. And that's I think that's going to be counterintuitive for most people. You'd think if I were cutting a frequency out, it shouldn't be ringing, right? Because I'm taking something out. But it needs to, filter impulse response needs to oscillate just to have the ability to lock in on a frequency and do something to that frequency without affecting the ones next to it. That's something that I'm not explaining very clearly, and to explain it would require probably a lot of math, or maybe we could think of a clever way to demonstrate it, but that's a thing to do on another day. The next thing I want to look at is, well, we haven't seen a low-pass filter. We'll look at just one, because compared to the high-pass filters, the low-pass filters look basically very similar. Let's turn this off. Let's do the low-pass filter, and let's have a Brickwall at, let's take the frequency down so where we can see it. So just like the high-pass filter, wherever I put the cutoff frequency, I'm going to get ringing there. And we'll have a look at what it looks like. Wow, now that is a lot of ringing. let's undo it and compare. Let's compare low pass against high pass. Is this low pass on? Well, the low pass is gray colored. All the others have bright colors, so it's kind of a bad choice of colors, I think. Let's put this at 1 kilohertz and go to Brickwall. High pass. Wow, those low pass and high pass actually look almost like the same filter. And in fact, mathematically, they are very close to each other. The difference between low pass and high pass is you see that the tail end looks basically the same, but there's a difference with what happens in front. Let's undo the low pass, go back to the high pass, and process that. So what we notice with the high pass filter is that the first sample, or first few samples that come out of it, we'll need to zoom out here so we can see this, will have the impulse going up, and then the next sample will go down. Whereas with the low pass, it won't have this this up down thing at the beginning. And if you remember when I did this earlier, I pulled one sample up and the next sample down, and that created a little bit of high pass effect, even without the ringing that comes after it. Just for fun, I'd like to see what happens when we low pass and high pass at the same time. We lost almost all the signal, but if we zoom in, I think we'll see it. Wow! Once again, you can see the more extreme your filtering is, the longer the time it takes to do it. So I thought I had to zoom in, but I see I don't have to zoom in. It's just that my impulse happened here, and these filters are so extreme that they're actually delaying the audio. Their time smearing effect has delayed the audio from here until way out in the back. It's long ringing going on. I think that pretty much covers the main thing I wanted to show you, but there's one more thing that I think is interesting to look at, and that's this isotope RX has some different filter types, and we've been looking at what they're calling analog filters, which are probably not models of analog circuits, but rather they are IIR filters, where the letters IIR stand for infinite impulse response. And the reason they're called infinite impulse response is because that ringing goes on infinitely long. Theoretically infinitely. Actually, at some point, it will become so quiet that it can't be represented by the numbers on a computer anymore. But as you've seen before, that we see the ringing going down to 0, but then sometimes we can zoom in on a region where it looks like it's 0 and it turns out not to be 0. So those Isotope is calling those analog filters because analog hardware doesn't have any other kind of filters that it could do. So all the filters that you get with analog hardware have that infinitely long ringing on the tail. When we go to digital, we are now getting finite impulse response filters, which have a very different behavior in the time domain. So let's have a look at what they do. Let's have a look at the Brickwall filter at, let's put it at 600 kilohertz. You can see the shape of this is different. The Brickwall analog filter had a straight line coming down, and the FIR filters tend to be a little bit more curved. So I'm going to need to move my impulse in order for us to adequately analyze this. So I'm moving the impulse later in the audio signal because I want to have more room on the left side over here, because you're going to see something interesting happening when I process these FIR filters. All right. So what we notice here, we can see already in the spectral domain, is that the ringing of the FIR filter happens not just after the impulse, but it also happens before the impulse. And that can be good, or it can be bad, depending on what your requirements are. So if you have a lot of ringing happening after transients, generally I feel like you want the ringing to be mostly after the transient. Because let's take a snare drum, for example. So I smack that snare drum, and then there's a ringing coming after. Well, the snare drum itself has some vibrations that go on after you hit the snare. And any physical musical instrument that you would touch to make it vibrate, that you touch it or hit it or pluck it or beat it with a stick, those things are going to vibrate, and the vibrations are going to happen after you hit them, not before. That would be really weird if they were vibrating before you hit them. And so if your filters have ringing and you're using IIR filters, which is what Isotope is calling analog filters, you can kind of safely hide that ringing of the filter inside the ringing of the actual object. For example, when you hit a snare drum, almost all snare drums ring a little bit, and we try to treat them so they don't ring so much, but they're always going to ring a little bit. And your filter ringing can kind of hide right in there. Whereas if you use FIR filters, like we're doing here, and you've got ringing before the snare drum hit, you cannot hide that. You're going to get like a zip. There's going to be like this zing that comes before the impulse, which is a really weird sound. Let's zoom in and have a look at this. So there it is, ringing on both sides, and you can see the amplitude of the ringing. The first lobe here is at about negative 45 dB, and then they go down on the side, but this is coming out till 1,000 samples on either side. So this is like 1,000 samples of pre-ringing. I hope this, I'm going to have to talk to Ming later. Ming is one of the other guys in our company, but he doesn't know I'm recording a video. So that is, what filter was that we just looked at? That was the high-pass filter. If we look at the low-pass filter, it's doing something, once again, very similar. It's going to have ringing on both sides, but there will be a little difference in how it handles the region right around the center. And you can see that the low-pass filter has smoothed out the impulse and created this, mathematically this is called the sync function, this hat. If you zoomed in on it, sometimes that looks like a sombrero. But once we get past this middle section, the low-pass filter has essentially the same thing left and right. So one of the things that we need to know if we're using FIR filters, or if you're using a filter plugin, and this would never happen in analog filters, but if you're using a digital filter plugin that does FIR filtering, is that it needs to have this symmetry on the left and right side, which means that the filter needs to be active before and after the impulse. And that implies that in order for this filtering to work, you need to delay your signal a little bit. So if your filter is ringing out, 1,000 samples on the left side of the impulse, it means that the only way that you can use that filter in a real-time audio processing situation is you will have to delay 1,000 samples in order to get that working. Now, if you're not processing in real time, if you're in a digital audio workstation or you're processing files the way I'm doing, you don't see any delay here. You can see when I go back to the original sample, the original impulse was here, and when I'm done filtering, it's still here. What's happened is that the Isotope RX is compensating for that delay by shifting things around after the filter is done, or by processing the filter in such a way that the output comes back with the correct timing. But this is only possible when you're processing a file on the disk or on the hard drive. You can't do that in real time. So if you're using any kind of effects that work in real time, they won't be using these FIR filters. Or if you do try to use FIR filters, you won't need to use very many plugins before you'll get an audible delay. And this is relevant to the discussion we had in the last video we released, which was about the distortion that you get from anti-aliasing filters. So the anti-aliasing filters we were looking at there were all the IIR anti-aliasing filters, which are the ones that are more similar to analog filters, and those don't require us to incur this delay when we do our processing, but they tend to do, let's say, more distortion of the, certainly more phase distortion, but just general more transient time domain distortion has to happen because all of the work that was done on this left side, all of that has to be sent on to the right side. And it's not quite as pretty when we don't have this symmetry. Same thing on left and right sides. This type of filtering has a nice way of, how could we say, it preserves the transient in the sense that well, I shouldn't say that. It has a different style of filtering, but it smears things around just like anything else does. So after the last video we did, someone asked us a question. I think they asked it on the Audio Bus forum, and his question was, we were looking at anti-aliasing filters that had a lot of ringing, a lot more than this in the tail, and he said, and the ringing was happening right up at the Nyquist frequency, right? Let's go back out here. There was a lot of ringing going on right up here because that's where the filter was operating near the Nyquist frequency. And he said to me, couldn't you just apply another filter and filter the ringing out? And I thought, yeah, that would work. Wouldn't that be great? So I took my, actually I used the EQ in Isotope RX, and I tried to filter it out using this. And it didn't work. And what happened was, here's an example of it. So imagine I have ringing up here, and I try to cut it off by putting a filter down. Let's back up a little bit. So imagine I've got ringing at the Nyquist frequency. In fact, I could do this, and then I'd have ringing at the Nyquist frequency. An anti-aliasing filter would be like up here at 20. Let's put it right at 20 kilohertz. Let's go. So there we go. Anti-aliasing filter. It's created this incredibly nasty ringing in my signal. Amazing what a mess that makes of your audio. So I've created this horrible ringing here, and then we were thinking, or the person on Audio Bus forum was suggesting to me, well, if you don't like this ringing here, why don't you just put a filter down a little lower and then you'll get rid of that ringing? And I was like, yeah, let me try that. So here's the ringing at 20 kilohertz. You can see it here. Let's just go down to like 18 kilohertz and we'll just filter that ringing out, right? No. Wherever you put the filter, you're going to get ringing at the cutoff frequency, and that's because I'm using, as anti-aliasing filter, I'm using this Brickwall type of filter which cuts off really fast. And that just isn't going to work. If I'm not willing to accept ringing, then I can't use that kind of filter. What I should do, and what I eventually did end up doing in the plugin that I was working on when I made that video, is I used a filter with a gentler slope. So at 20 kilohertz, I put a filter that had, I think it was probably more than 48 decibels per octave, but a gentler slope. And now you can see there's some ringing going on here, but it's not nearly the kind of ringing that I was getting when I used that Brickwall filter. But now the disadvantage of this is that if you don't use a filter with a steep slope, you're not going to cut out all the frequencies that you need to cut out in order to do anti-aliasing. So that's what we did in that plugin is we used a Brickwall filter at 24 kilohertz to cut everything off above 24 kilohertz. And then I used a gentler filter down at about 20 kilohertz to smooth out the ringing at the upper end. So if you're interested in this type of thing, consider clicking the subscribe button. If you click that, it means that next time we do a video, you're likely to get that prioritized in your YouTube video feed so that you're likely to see it. We'd like you to click like on this video. That'll help our channel grow and help YouTube show our videos to more people.